management. I might just start the panel off and just open up the question for discussion. And the first question that we wanted to explore is how NZNO has changed in the years that you've been engaged in it. So if you're okay, I'll just open the question up and people can contribute at their will.
I could start off if you like, if no one else wants to. As I mentioned, I was really brought in to be president. I had worked in the mental hospitals, which was, we were represented by the PSA. And I was one of the few mental hospital nurses who was also a member of the New Zealand Nurses Association, and I had I'd been on the Nurses and Midwives Board as the NZNA nominee and some NZNA committees. But the mental hospitals went over to the hospital boards in 1972, and there was a lot of industrial unrest, and the PSA made a challenge to take over the representation of nurses, which really, I think, scared the executive into wondering just how to cope with that. And at the same time, David Wills emerged as representing nurses in the Auckland area, and I was interested to hear him a few weeks ago. He's sort of come back 50 years later. And so I was approached by nearly every branch in the country to be nominated. So I knew before the election that I was going to be appointed as president. So I took over an organisation that was quite small, and it was a professional body, and it was run by senior nurses. There were all, the executive were matrons in chief or such like. And it was all very proper. Everyone wore hats and gloves, as we did in those days, and were all very ladylike. There certainly weren't any men, and weren't any Maori people either. So the first, so I had this challenge of how to really save the association, I guess. And so we had quite a big upheaval as we tried to get a role as industrial representatives of nurses. And I had quite a stormy meeting. We went up to the Auckland Hospital Board, who were negotiating with David Wills, and asked them, or discussed with them, the fact that we were the representatives of, to represent nurses. And the chairman told me he accepted that the carpenters had to be represented industrially, but he didn't accept that nurses had to. And at that point, ushered me out of his office in the Smith & Coy building, where he was the head of that firm. So that was an indication of what was happening on that side. And by the time I finished, we had appointed our first industrial advocate. We also, other things that happened in my time was we registered the union, and later on, when I was director of nursing, I think it was about 1980 probably, a group of Maori nurses decided or advised me that they were forming a separate organisation, which I was very concerned about, because I didn't want to see another group outside of the Nurses Association, even though it wasn't my business as Director of Nursing in the Health Department. But I actually met with them, and I subsequently went with them, I think, to about, it seems in hindsight, about 30 marae, as they took their taki around the country and got support from their people and formed a group within the association. I was trying to think of the name of the nurse who led it. She came from somewhere up Wanganui. I could find her name. She appeared again as an assistant. I've forgotten her name. The leader of the Maori party, the Maori nurse from Wanganui. But anyhow, that was so I was very involved in the formation of the Maori nurses group at a time when there just weren't any Maori nurses anywhere in the hierarchy. But the major thing that I was involved in, as in my time as president, was nurses had been trying to get nursing education in the system of general education for 50 years, and nothing had ever happened. And I knew that we had to have a platform to get all nurses united to push for something in common. And I identified that that's what it was. So we had this big campaign to put pressure on the government to get the decision to move nursing education to the system of general education. And we got a decision within the first year to get the first two technical institutes shifted. In that process, I got a poster that we put up all over the country, mainly in nurses' homes. And in it, we had that nurses demand that the government transfer nursing education. And the senior nurses, well, the hospital boards were furious to have posters on their property. But the word demand really upset people, and about half the executive resigned because they claimed that nurses didn't demand, and it wasn't, ladylike to be using that sort of language. So I guess that's a sort of a thumbnail sketch of the organisation as it was, and it's certainly I was president for 2 years, and there's certainly, because of that time, I actually moved into the wider field of nursing. Before I went to be president, my career was very much restricted to the mental hospitals. Even though I had general training, there was no question of us moving into the wider stream of nursing. And so I was grateful for that period as president because it set my career on quite a different path. Thank you.
Shall I go next?
Yeah, sure.
Could I go next? Because I do have to go at a certain time.
Yes,
if that's all right with everyone.
Sure, Whaihanirongo.
Okay. Look, I go back many years, and I was, when it was like the previous speaker said, when it was NZNO, and I did my first lot of training in Dannevirke, basically, a little country hospital that had a very good nursing school. And we weren't at all union-minded, so all we did was pay a fee and didn't know much about it because nothing was ever done. It wasn't, I never finished my training because I went overseas. But basically, when I came up, I got married and came up here to Hamilton, I ended up working in private hospitals, and an issue occurred that became quite a big issue, went right around at one of the hospitals in which I led a group of nurse caregivers and basically, or caregivers and all nurses, in which they were having to do not only nursing chores and that, but also laundry chores. So we said, no, that's not what we're employed for. So it created quite a bit, and that drew the attention. And I didn't know much about NZNO. And suddenly I was asked, there was a position, and I always think a position was made because they were trying to establish a core for Māori workers within the private health sector, nurse aides and caregivers, even registered nurses and that, where their issues weren't dealt with because it was a private section. I found it a bit difficult to get involved because unions and that hadn't been a favourite thing with me, but they kept putting off the final date until I ended up applying for the position as an organiser in the Waikato Bay of Plenty, and which I got, which was a foregone conclusion. It was really set up, and the whole idea was to establish a Māori Nurses Rūnanga within NZNO. They'd been trying to set one up earlier. The unfortunate thing, they used a non-Māori. She was excellent, Jane, but it caused a lot of problems, not only with Māori workers, but also with non-Māori. And there was, she got quite abused because he was a Pākehā lass trying to establish a Rūnanga. And it wasn't accepted by either of the races, basically. Neither the Pākehā nurses or the Māori nurses or Māori would accept this. So I was brought in for this specific reason, to try and establish. It was probably the hardest job I've ever had, because when I took it and got set up in an office, there was discussion in the previous speaker about this Māori nurses group called, I think they were called the Council of Māori Nurses in those days, who were trying to establish an organisation for Māori within NZNA. And basically, they gave me hell, to be quite frank, because they felt that I was being manipulated by non-Māori to serve the purposes of Pākehā. Not only were they the ones who gave me hell, but also some of the Māori workers within the private sector. They felt that establishing the Rūnanga was setting a division. And I had a lot of working with Māori workers within the health sector, explaining that there was nothing there for them in the private sector, and it was only through this organisation could we address the injustices and their needs. And we had trouble getting any registered Māori nurses to even look at it. So I ended up, we established a very small group, and I got a lass who was a caregiver in Cambridge called Dutch Stutchbury to stand in to be the chairperson for the interim until we could find somebody. I knew for us to be accepted within the whole structure of NZNO at that stage, we had to have a registered nurse leading us. And it took me 6 months to find one, and that was Angela. Angela was the first registered nurse who accepted the role of to lead the Rūnanga. And it was during the amalgamation of NZNA and NZNO that we again had to go through quite a horrific time in which they accepted us, but only as a special group. In other words, we weren't recognised as being equal partners or as being our registered nurses and that as having a rights. So we fought hard on that. I don't know if you remember those who at this time, how Angela, we really fought hard. And as I worked for NZNO, I couldn't be at those meetings. But we arranged, Angela and I, that I was on the phone all the time while she was trying to establish the right for Māori nurses within this new organisation. And at stages, I kept encouraging her not to give way. Eventually, the chairperson at that time was a male, I forget his name, and he supported Angela. And we got accepted as being part of, not just being a special part of anything, but we were still treated as not being that important. We still had to work hard to establish our rights within the organisation of NZNO. It was tough because not only was we fighting our rights with non-Māori, we were also having to put up with other Māori organisations, particularly Māori Nurses Council, who by this time had fallen out of favour with NZNA, and they were saying, giving us trouble. No matter when I got invited to attend unions, student dues, my life was hell. But thank goodness I was strong enough that I was able to take all the nonsense. Now, I think you talked about a nurse now. I don't know if you're trying to remember Puti O'Brien, who was one of the foremost people of the Maori Nurses Council. Yes. She apologised for the behaviour of the Nurses Council at that time, the Maori Nurses Council, because she could see that they were trying to cut me out all the time, and the students wanted to hear what we could do for them. And it was a battle. We had different presidents. When Angela had served her time, and she did an absolutely marvellous job, she took that big step to get us accepted within NZNO as an identity of rights. But it wasn't easy, and as Kerry can tell you, it's never been easy. And as I've grown older, I've got less tolerant towards what I consider to be nurses, intolerance towards us. Because it's not about a competition, it's about a right. And I used to give people hell by saying, and I know that a lot of people find this offensive, but I have to say, I'm tangata whenua, and I have a right to be able to speak for the rights of my people. It's been, I thought at one stage, what we've got to now has been brilliant, but it's taken years. It hasn't been something that it's a right fallen into our lap. We've had to fight all the way to have recognition. My father is Pākehā, my mother's Māori, part Māori, but I was not brought up in a Māori environment. But I'm still very proud of being both Pākehā and Māori. But my heart goes out to our Māori because basically they've always had to be that step behind. Thank God for people that we've had, particularly like Kerry, who's had to fight the battle. And at times, she's been subjected to things people had no right to subject her to. And I'm not only talking about non-Maoris, I'm talking about Māoris as well. The jealousies and the not looking at the forward steps we need to take all the time. The stories I could tell about what we went through are quite unbelievable. But I have never shared those. You've got to understand about Māori. We're very cautious about the stories we give out, the things that do happen. I was the one who started off under Stephanie Breen to initiate the Rūnanga. It has grown well beyond what I started off to what it is now. But my heart is still with them. And basically, I still say that we, as both Māori and non-Māori, can work together. And we should be able to work together and understand and respect each other's cultures. I ended up going back and getting my degree in nursing and finished off doing my post-grad in health and social services. And in that time, I was working at Wintec, and I taught whakaruho and then filled in with other issues when they needed somebody because maybe the other tutors took sick. But I also took another big role, and that was as the kaiwhina. Now, people wonder what a kaiwhina was. A kaiwhina is a helping hand, a person there. It's an older Maori person who is there to support and help others through. And my job was to look after Maori students. The unfortunate part, I must have done a very good job because suddenly I was not only looking after Maori students, I had non-Maori, I had different nationalities coming to me for help. But my job was basically to help improve and bring more Maori nurses to get qualified, to get into the field of nursing, to look after our people. Mm. I look at the things as they're going now, and I'm astounded at the work Kerry does. I'm astounded at some of the rubbish she has to put up with. I'm going to be very honest about this because I thought that we'd got past all that nonsense. I had to put up with it. Why does Kerry have to put up with it? I thought we would grow and go forward and work together in unity. That's what I see as the important part of this unitedness of different races. I have to be very careful because sometimes as you get older, you lose your temper and you'll say things and you're thinking, no, maybe I shouldn't have said that. But I support Kerry totally because I've seen what she's done. We've got to this point of who we are and what we are, of a build-up of the different people who've come in and taken leadership of the Rūnanga. But Kerry is the one who's putting those finishing touches to it. But like I believe, it never ends. So people like Kerry are needed at all stages, and hopefully that she will stay there for us. I'm a life member of the Rūnanga, and the Rūnanga is where my heart is, to be quite frank. Maori nurses, we have not enough, and we need to bring more in. There are many things basically that there have been huge changes, but we're still not getting enough of our Maori people to come in and to qualify and give help out to basically our people who need all that help, particularly around health. I've slowed down a lot, and I'm grateful basically that I did have that little input at the beginning. And like I was saying, there's a lot of stories that I could share with everybody, but until I get around to putting those stories together and have faith that those stories will be recognised for what they are and what we went through. I don't think I've got much more to say, but all I can say is thank you, Kerry, for bringing me into this. I've tried to be tolerant, and I've also tried to share a little bit of the things we went through without exposing too much. Thank you. I think that's all I've got to say.
Kia ora whaia, Hiri no more, and thank you for sharing your journey, and we do know that your journey's about to. You've got another appointment as well, and we don't want to hold you up, but we value your kōrero, your contributions, and your continued support at our hui, and know that that there's been times that you've unselfishly given us as Māori nurses the support, and often it's at the tension and detriment to your own whānau that we, as you're building up the support and developing up the voice of Māori within the organisation, has often meant it's come at the price of being and spending time with your own whānau. So we absolutely appreciate the mahi that you've done and the legacy that you started, and the mahi that the Māori nurses are on is because of the work that you've done in establishing the voice. So thank you for your mahi and contributions. And thank you for being our lead claimant in the Waitangi Tribunal, Kaupapa Māori Health Inquiries and the Manawahi Inquiries. And that's a testament of the rights arguments that you've made earlier, and continuing us on our journey and aspiring us to maintain the advocacy for Māori within the sector. So thank you, Whaia Hiri no more. Beverly, would you like to contribute?
Thank you. Well, my journey with the New Zealand Nurses Organisation started in prelim school, as I said, in 1965, when a delegate came along to talk to us about the benefits of joining what was then called the Student Nurses Association. And I can remember going home and discussing this with my parents, you know, because it was a union, and was it right and proper for a very naive 17-year-old to be joining something that she didn't fully comprehend? And my father, to my surprise, because he was an employer, said, yes, you have to join your union. So joined the union I did. And at that stage, we were only involved really at a conference level. We did have some meetings I can remember going to, and then I remember going to my first SNA conference. Well, I was hooked on conferences after that. I found it absolutely exhilarating because we had been in our own little bubble in our own little school of nursing, and there were other nurses sharing the same successes, failures, concerns, that we were experiencing, and we thought we were alone in this. And it gave me great heart to know that nurses throughout the nation were feeling the same things that we were in our little bubble. Perhaps bubble isn't quite the word to be using in this COVID era, but you understand. And from there, once I graduated, I moved and continued my association with what was then called the New Zealand Nurses Association. And we used to have branch meetings, of which I attended. I really enjoyed those, and there again I was fortunate enough to be able to represent the area at various conferences. I found them very stimulating, knowing what was happening in the rest of the country. And at that stage I was also involved with what was the midwives interest group, which later became the Midwives Special Interest Group, which later became the College of Midwives. And I was the local president for a while, so I was able to travel around the region and see how our other midwives were practicing, and also tried to join them in with what was happening at our regional level. NZNO, as it was then, were very supportive of the special interest groups when they were established, and we had a lot of support from the staff to ensure their ongoing success. I think that around about the 80s and 90s, there were several factors that influenced me from an NZNO perspective. I think the first one Dame Margaret has alluded to, and that was the transfer of the nursing education from hospital-based apprentice type training to the polytechnic education system. I can remember from a clinical practice perspective, we were exceedingly sceptical of these new graduation nurses from this different education system. And a lot of paranoia ensued. And as Dame Margaret said, NZNO, well, I can remember taking our concerns to our local meetings, and we had many a time discussing the pros and cons of this new system. But NZNO were very supportive of this, so we trusted our nursing leaders in this aspect. The second influence was in 1990 when the Labour-led government granted midwives autonomy. At that stage I was practicing as a midwife, and it influenced my practice in that a lot of our very experienced midwives left the public system to go and work independently. And so to try and encourage choice for women within the secondary and tertiary systems, we provided teams of midwives, and they of course worked quite differently to the shift work midwives. NZNO were really involved at that time, looking at work conditions and salaries for these midwives working and practicing in a different manner. And we had many hours of negotiation coming to an agreement for just and fair pay parity for the midwives working within the public system, so that we could retain basically our skill and nursing abilities. The third thing that impacted on myself was the major restructuring that was occurring at NZNO. When we had, I think it was 54 branches, and we changed to 11 regional councils. Now, at the branch level, any member of what was then NZNO could attend. And they were very lively meetings on the whole. Somebody would bring an issue and it would be discussed. Now we were having to go to workplace meetings, and you could only go to the regional council if you were a delegate through the workplace meeting. My participation in NZNO up to that point had been fairly consistent. I had enjoyed the meetings, I had enjoyed networking through conferences and the special interest groups. However, because I was at that stage the supervisor of delivery suite, I was considered management, and so therefore I was not allowed to attend the workplace meetings. And so I was quite upset about this. However, that has subsequently changed. But it did affect me for a while, and my, I guess, I wasn't involved directly, and so I was only hearing things that were happening at NZNO through my staff that were attending the meetings, and I found that very dissatisfying. And I think at this stage too, there was quite a rise within NZNO with involvement with the industrial side or the industrial branch of the organisation. There was always two branches to the organisation, the professional branch and the industrial side. But with the workplaces, with the rise of the workplace meetings, my opinion was that people attending the workplace meetings were bringing workplace issues to their meetings, whereas at the branch meetings, you had nurses from all aspects of NZNO coming to the meetings and discussing things in common rather than specific things that were being discussed within the workplace. And of course, following on from that, there became an increasing demand on NZNO for legal services. This came about really through the working environment, the changing working environment, Patients' Bill of Rights, accountability and responsibility was coming to the fore as a result of much work being done on patients' concerns. Of course, then we had the Cartwright Report and things like that that influenced the way that we practiced. And I think now we have a fine balance between the professional and the industrial branches of NZNO, and that is very heartening. I think that's about all I have to say about the influences, apart from the fact, of course, which our other speakers have alluded to, was the huge impact and that our increasing knowledge and acknowledgement of cultural practices and cultural awareness came to the fore, and the effect that had on people like myself coming from the bottom of the South Island, where our exposure to a lot of Maori customs and norms, and even people who identified as Maori, were not as common as the North Island. And I know that NZNO and also our workplaces put a lot of effort into educating us to be culturally appropriate in these coming times. So those were the influences that affected me and my association with NZNO over my time.
Thank you, Beverly. That was a really amazing journey, and I learned so much about NZCOM and the establishment of that. And I think that's really, really useful whakapapa for us to remember. And even the restructuring of NZNO from the branches to the regional councils, and how perhaps in some of that transition, we lost some of that engagement, just as nurses coming together with a commonality, as opposed to nurses that come together to talk about specific industrial issues. So those are really important things for us to remember, that we shouldn't lose moving forward. But I think, thank you very much for that. Now, Ashley, you've been waiting there very patiently. And so I'd just like to open it up to you to contribute.
Kia ora, Kerry. My journey with NZNO is nearing 2 years now. So I was first introduced to NZNO at my interview, as joining the organisation was compulsory for our nursing school. And from then, the organiser for our region came and presented at our orientation, again talking about the benefits of joining. And yeah, basically from there, I guess I made it my mission to get as involved as possible and surround myself with like-minded individuals. And by all means, it's been an incredibly positive experience, an incredibly supportive experience for me. And I've enjoyed every moment so far. Just thinking about the changes, I guess one of the, whilst I am still new, one of the biggest challenges for me over this time has certainly been navigating the media publications concerning the resignation of the President and the subsequent Board of Directors members earlier this year. I think as a nation already sort of navigating such unprecedented times, it was just really disheartening to witness I guess what I saw as attempts to divide us as a people, and scrutinise our leadership. And while this is nothing new for Māori, I feel it has actually, in fact, strengthened us in unity, and just reminded us of how far we've come, how much further we can go as we continue this challenge and striving towards our purpose of achieving collective health and well-being for our people.
Good, Ash. And that's really an important statement that you make, because the younger generation, and I'm certainly not part of that, but the way that education and the way that we engage with communication has evolved. So that's certainly one of those things that we need to remember as we develop. How do we remain in touch with our younger folk? And also, how do we manage how that communication comes across, and how do we unify as a group, regardless of the threats, or as Dame Margaret talked about, the threat to association and maintaining its industrial voice, but also moving forward to cope with whatever happens.